Well, as every year, Pastor Tyler and Pastor Joe go to the SBC convention. How many years have you guys been going?
I remember going as a kid, like on
wow.
vacation, basically. Like, you know, when you're a pastor's kid, that was...
So that's what vacation is as a pastor's kid?
From the early 90s, I remember going. So I went to a lot of them back then.
Wow.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think I've attended 5 or 6 or 7 of them. So I'm a relative newcomer to it, but I still love going every year. So I'm glad we get to go.
Well, and I saw the insert you wrote on Sunday, Pastor Tyler. So let's start with just the 30,000-foot view. Just give us an idea of what you guys heard and saw when you were there.
Yeah, so 30,000-foot view. Well, first of all, in terms of going to Indianapolis, I have to say I enjoyed the food. I am a sucker for a spicy chicken sandwich, and I might have found the best one in America.
Really?
Shout out to Dave's Hot Chicken. I ate there twice in 3 days, I'm going to confess.
Wow.
I walked 40 minutes across town to go to Dave's Hot Chicken. It was good. I loved it. So
Wow. Thanks for telling me about Dave's Hot Chicken.
You're welcome.
Are you finding this out now, or did he tell you during the convention?
No, he did not tell me.
Oh, no.
This is the first I've heard of it.
Oh, no.
And that would have been a food I could have eaten.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So overall, though, I would say I was encouraged by the SBC. You know, every year I go, you know, leading up to it, there's always discussions online, and there's some concerns about this issue, that issue, this person, that sort of polarizing topic. But what I once again was reminded this year is that the SBC online and the SBC in the room are two very different groups. And that the SBC in the room, when we get together, it is sensible, it is level-headed, it is cooperation and kingdom focused, and I think this year only proved that again. So I walked away encouraged. I mean, doesn't mean I agree with or like everything, but I'd say by and large I'm still very much appreciative. So Joe, how about you?
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. It's always an encouraging time. I think one of the things that encourages me is there was another denomination who recently held their annual meeting. You know, they were debating things about ordaining openly gay, lesbian ministers and stuff. Our focus was, how are we going to spread the gospel?
Amen.
How are we going to reach the lost? How are we going to engage unreached people with the name of Jesus Christ? And it's so starkly different in what the two denominations were trying to achieve.
And since then, there's been another denomination, we won't name any names, but they were discussing polyamorous relationships, condoning that.
Wow.
And you're thinking, wow, how far do you have to get when that's the point of discussion? So,
And when those are the things that are the point of discussion,
right.
Christ is not.
That's right.
Right.
What else do we really have to talk about other than Christ?
Right.
So it appears we elected a new president, Clint Presley from Hickory Grove Baptist Church. I recognize that church name. Right. That's interesting. So walk me through this election process, who these players are, who our new president is.
Yeah. So this was a different year for several reasons. Number one, 6 candidates. I think that's the biggest slate that I've ever seen.
Oh, wow.
It went 3 runoffs, so we had to keep voting because they have to win 50% plus 1. So we had to get all the way down 3 times. Yeah, I think Clint was the best known. I think it's safe to say he was like the establishment candidate in terms of the things he's done in the past, in terms of his leadership. I don't know him personally. I've had a meal with him once and talked to him a few times through my brother, and feel like, you know, he's a bold leader. He is a diehard conservative. He believes the Bible. He's a fast talker and a good dresser, by the way. He's
That's
one of the
combo.
best sharp dressed guys in the convention, and I think in all those sense we're in very good hands. And on a side note, the previous president, Bart Barber, I thought was excellent. I mean, for a guy who pastors a church that's smaller than Forest, in that position, his integrity, his leadership, I thought was superb. And I thought he didn't just lead, but pastored the convention through some tough waters. But I expect Clint to do the same as he did. So I would have thought that of the 6 candidates, I would say that 2/3 of them, I would have been fine if any of them were president. A couple of them I felt like maybe had agendas, just knowing what little bit kind of is out there.
Yeah.
So I don't feel like anybody was going to be damaging, but I felt like Clint was the one who had the most electability that way. So
I am not overly disappointed that Clint was elected. as president. I think he will do a good job. And I don't have any beef against the man who is put up like he was. Where I started taking issue, and it trickled down to all of the officers that we were voting on. Before I got to the convention, and I'm researching these, you look at who's been nominated. Are they taking a position in the convention or within their churches that I can agree with? Who nominated them? Because there are some people on the fringe who have a soapbox and they get up and nominate their candidate that's going to best support their soapbox issues. But what it basically came down for me in all of the votes for the officers, I became a one-issue voter. I did not vote for Clint Presley. And the reason is his church gives a grand total of 2.4% of their undesignated offerings to the cooperative program. And sadly, the majority of all of the candidates give under 5% to the cooperative program. Contrast that to our church, we give 12% to the cooperative program. Now, our amount is less because our budget and our receipts are less.
Yeah.
But comparatively speaking, I'm happy where our church is with their giving to the cooperative program. Keep in mind, the cooperative program is basically what sets us apart from any other Baptist church. Southern Baptist churches are bound together because we do the work of the ministry cooperatively, and that's how we do our missions. To put up a nominee for any of the officer positions who are supposed to lead our convention to only be giving 2% to the cooperative program, I don't think that's putting your money where your mouth is.
I follow you, yeah.
And because of that, I voted for different candidates. I'm not going to get upset that my candidate didn't win. I will still work cooperatively with the denomination, but I was disappointed in seeing CP giving from the majority of the candidates. I think the highest presidential nominee, their church gave 9%, and that's who I was voting for. I also align with his theology and his method of doing things, but I liked seeing that 9%, which was the highest of any of them.
And I'll add to that, ideologically, Joe and I agree on that. I find that it's kind of embarrassing how little some churches give that are in some of those more prominent positions. Now, again, their budgets are in the millions or tens of millions of dollars, right? So you're talking much bigger figures that way. But yeah, in terms of percentage-based giving.
And interestingly, the candidate I was supporting made it to that final vote.
Yeah, right.
And it came down between him and
that was
Clint
probably
Presley.
was a motivating factor for others.
Right.
I really do suspect that too.
And for the candidates that are put out there, they do have a bio written up on them, and it includes that. So everybody can see that.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that it drives the way they vote.
So before we get into some of the bigger things on the bulletin insert, was there anything you didn't get to write about that was mentioned or talked about?
Yeah, great question. So a couple just quick highlights that I'll mention. Number one of the discussions in recent years has been baptism numbers, because they've been down year after year. Well, this is the first year we've seen an uptick in baptisms.
Oh, great.
Across the Southern Baptist Convention.
Awesome.
So now membership was down overall, so that's kind of a funny thing. Although I'm not sure that's a bad thing, because we have probably a lot of bloated membership records in a lot of SBC churches.
Yeah.
So that actually may be a healthy thing in some ways. But participation was up and baptisms were up across the SBC. And I found that very encouraging. We had a new executive director, Jeff Org. He was leading the Gateway Seminary in California. I was actually going to retire, but instead has moved into this position. So the executive committee is like ongoing sort of hub for all things SBC. So we vote on things every year. Somebody has to actually make it happen the other 363 days a year. And so that's what the executive committee does. And so that's a really important job. And I think time will tell, but I think he's a good guy, and I think his leadership will be good at this time. There was a specific resolution about religious liberty, which I was very happy to see was passed, mostly because it was a rejection of what's become now a talking issue of Christian nationalism, where there are some conservative Christians, and I think well-meaning, although some a little unhinged in my opinion, that are trying to sort of make a state religion out of Christianity, and historically Baptists are against that. And I think we need to remember remember why that is,
Yeah.
why that matters. And this resolution, which I didn't get a lot of press outside of us, I thought was a really good reminder of we're not really for that. We're for religious liberty, that faith is a matter of the conscience. And then maybe the last thing I didn't write about was the cooperation group task force. You know, there's obviously a lot of Southern Baptists. Sometimes we don't always cooperate. And so they had a group that was intended to say, how can we cooperate? What are things we can do? And they had some very good recommendations that were all approved, 4 of them, which I wholeheartedly agree with. And so I was super appreciative of their work. Interestingly, I didn't know this. And Joe, I don't know if you knew this or not. You assume, there's X number of Southern Baptist churches, 40,000 or whatever it is. I learned at the convention, there's no list. Did you?
Right. Yes, I heard that.
Like, there's no official list.
Huh.
And that was one of the things that they were saying. We think we ought to keep an official list because you say, this is SBC Church. What makes them that? What, was that 30 years ago? Was that recent? And so they were saying, hey, the executive committee needs to look at the viability of doing that. And I was like, okay, well, if they didn't know that, then certainly the rest of us, should. So,
if you go to their website, you can do a find a church search.
Yeah.
But as they said, who knows how old that church is or how long ago it was that they made a contribution to the Southern Baptist.
It could be 30 years old and they've disengaged and they're not technically SBC, but they've gave once, though, therefore they're on the website.
Exactly.
And that's not smart,
Yeah.
One thing that rarely gets any kind of coverage, there's a brief report in the convention for this, but every year, wherever the convention is being held, there is what's called crossover. So this year it was Crossover Indy. And what that is on Friday and Saturday before the pastors conference and before the convention starts, volunteers get together and literally just go out and evangelize whatever city it is where we are meeting. Some of that is simply just praying for people, specifically sharing the gospel with them. Some of it is compassion ministry, feeding and helping them do things in their house. And the neat thing about this year with Crossover Indy is there were 185 responses to the gospel presentations.
Oh, wow. Amen.
We don't just go in as a bunch of Southern Baptists from all over the country, hit them with the gospel, and then our convention is over and we leave.
Yeah.
We're doing this through local pastors, so the state conventions, the local conventions, local pastors. And so when these people hear the gospel and choose to respond to it at that time, they're immediately plugged in and given opportunities to get involved in a local church that is a Bible-believing, Bible-preaching church. And so we don't just drop them, count the number, and then drop them. I am always excited about that.
Well, and speaking of the ERLC, what happened there with that?
Yeah, so the ERLC, the Ethics Religious Liberty Commission, is kind of the policy arm of the SBC. They do 2 things. They speak both for Southern Baptists on usually political, moral, social issues, and they also speak to Southern Baptists, right? So helping us to understand, a Supreme Court ruling or, some law that's come down. And so the ERLC in recent years has become fashionable, popular to sort of hate on them. They've been kind of bullied around or now maybe for good reason in some things, but the ERLC in recent years, there have been people that have made motions to defund them or to reduce their funding or to reallocate their funding to weaken them. And this year there was a motion made to abolish them, like kind of the nuclear option of motions. But I think the thing this year that was most startling was the number of people that voted in favor. Now, it failed, but I would say, and I checked with some friends of mine, and Joe, they said probably 30% of the room, just based on their kind of rough estimate. It was a lot larger than anybody expected.
Wow.
The reasons for it, I think, are complicated. The ERLC, I do not envy their job, trying to be the conscience of the SBC, but also speaking into moral issues. Supreme Court legal type work. They have offices in D.C. and Nashville. Some of those things are just complicated on what they do and don't do. Some people, it seems to think they're too political. Some people seem to think they're not political enough. Some people would say they're woke. Some people would say they're not woke enough. And so it's funny that it's like strange bedfellows that are all sort of zeroing in on, I don't like the ERLC. I think in general, though, it appears that some of their talking points or emphasis are a little disconnected from your average SBC pastor, and so it's almost like they've become a voice unto themselves, maybe a bit of an echo chamber, as if they're speaking and working independent.
I think there are some topics that they tackle that is not quite what Southern Baptists think they should be tackling.
Right.
But it makes sense in the long run. For example, when the Supreme Court had the case brought before it several years ago with the 12-year-old Muslim girl from Dearborn, Michigan, who was prohibited from wearing her hijab to school. The school administration said that it was disruptive and distractive and she couldn't wear it. And that's a part of exercising their religion, which we have already said we support having that conscience and freedom in religious liberty. So when that court case went all the way to Supreme Court, the ERLC became a supporter of the lawsuit against the school district, and so it appeared that we were supporting Muslims.
Yeah, the optics on that are a little
the
rough.
Optics were difficult, and what we were really supporting is religious freedom.
Right. Understood.
And if they take away the right of a 12-year-old Muslim girl to not wear a hijab, what are they going to say to our Christian young people who on their lunch break are reading their Bible at their own table?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. And so sometimes we have to support things that don't necessarily appear to be Southern Baptist because for evangelicalism, it is a win or it could be a loss.
Right, right.
And so, as Tyler said, I don't envy the work of the ERLC.
Yeah, that's tough.
It is a tightrope that they are constantly walking. And I think out of any of the agencies, they are probably more in the spotlight than any other agency because they're on Capitol Hill and the media picks up what they do very quickly.
And politics is the national pastime right now, right?
It is,
and so when you have them just sort of even trying to nudge here and there, if you don't nudge exactly as I want or think, for some Southern Baptists, then, now all of a sudden they're an easy target.
Okay, so one of the things that gets a lot of tensions every year is resolutions. So what kind of resolutions did we look at this year?
Yeah, so, resolutions, which sometimes can be confusing because you have things like motions, you have recommendations, you have resolutions. They all have
different vocabulary.
They all have a different meaning. A resolution is simply, it's a non-binding statement that we make. And really the way to think of it is it's not setting doctrine, it's not establishing a position, it's just the convention speaking at one point in time about a particular issue. So you can actually look up, I did not too long ago to look at resolutions on gambling. I was just looking up something, and there's been like 10 or 11 over the years, and some were very pointed, some were a little softer, and so you can kind of see how that's evolved over time with the convention. So it's just a statement for that year. A couple years ago, there was one on critical race theory, got a lot of attention, because that was a hot topic in the culture. So churches don't have to, adopt them. It's just a statement from the convention that year. This year, there were 10 that were put forward. 8 were voted on because of time. So 2 actually just got left out. Of the 8, I think the one that probably got the most attention in the news was the one related to IVF, in vitro fertilization, and reproductive technology was the issue. In general, the statement, which I fully supported, the resolution, which I fully supported, it really just, it sounded the alarm about the ethical problems that come with IVF technology, reproductive technology. Baptists will hear, well, we're pro-life, and IVF, that's about, creating life.
Sure.
Okay, but we got to kind of stop and look at what that means. And so the way it's done typically is very difficult. In fact, I'll go so far as to say, if I can put it this way, I think IVF is more problematic, is more serious than even abortion. And here's why I say that. What does abortion do? Well, it destroys a human life. What does IVF do? You create these embryos in mass, and then the majority of them get destroyed. But what happens before that? Number one, what happens is a form of eugenics, because they pick the best ones.
Sure.
Right? So it's kind of a quality. These are the ones deserving.
Right.
These are the ones not. All right? So that's a problem. Number 2, it's borderline slavery because you're sticking them on a shelf. So you've created embryos, you've created life, and you've just put them on a shelf somewhere, not to have freedom to grow, right, as they should. Then it borders on torture because they're frozen, right? I mean, imagine a life, right? If we believe that life begins at conception, so we're creating life, putting it on a shelf, locking it in a freezer, and then destroying it when it's not the kind that we want. And so the ethical issues to this are really problematic. It's creating the commodification of human beings, essentially. And I think there's so much money involved and politics involved. And so what's interesting about this resolution is that it actually placed Southern Baptists out of step with both major political parties. Both sides, Democrats, Republicans, are supportive of IVF and kind of like unrestricted in some ways. We're actually kind of the oddball saying, wait a minute, let's stop and think about what we're doing here from a pro-life position. So now, again, if you read it carefully, it's not saying every instance of IVF is wrong, because I think there's a way to do it. If you fertilize 2 embryos, that's in keeping with, how God's created our bodies, right? But to create dozens or hundreds and then knowing we're going to just toss most of them, is where the real problem comes. And so I'm thankful that we spoke to this so clearly and definitively, but I really do think it's showing that a robust pro-life vantage point is actually becoming more and more odd, even amongst conservatives, sort of social political conservatives. So I'm proud of us. I thought we did the right thing. I hope we continue to fight that good fight. So and I think, again, some of it is just that, like you hear, life, wanting to have a baby is, that's a good and right desire, right?
You think sperm, you think egg come together.
Right.
What's the big deal?
That's right. Al Mohler compared this, and I thought in a good way. He compared this. He says, not all reproductive technology is good technology. And so he compared it. He said, all life is good and all children are gifts, but that doesn't mean we celebrate fornication. A life comes out of it, therefore it's good. No, like the Bible clearly puts some parameters on that. And so once the child is, conceived, then we care for the child and the mother and the families involved, but that we don't then give a green light to fornication. We recognize that's a sin. And likewise, creating life to destroy it, at least wholesale, as it's generally done, I think is something we need to think more about and talk more about, because reproductive technology is only getting faster. And I think sometimes we're kind of slow on the response.
I went into the resolution portion of business with the intent of opposing that resolution. The reason for my opposition to it was not because I devalue life, and it's not because I don't think that life begins at conception, but rather I had a distaste in my palate for the way it was coming across, and I thought that it was harsh and unsympathetic to Christian couples and non-Christian who are having problems conceiving naturally, who have a desire to have children, and especially in Christian realms, being able to raise those children to become Christ followers. And I thought the overall tone of the resolution was harsh on couples in that situation. And so I intended to vote against it. I probably read that one resolution 10 or more times before I could fully grasp and understand what it was saying. And it in reality was not saying don't do IVF. The bottom line was think about what's going on. But you can correct me if I'm wrong, Tyler, because you're reading it. I don't think it outright forbids IVF. It's just saying you're creating life. You're creating more life than is needed to implant those babies into a woman's uterus, and then the remaining embryos are destroyed. So let's think about it before we go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And so in the end, I wouldn't have minded voting against it, even if I was the only one, if I firmly believed in voting against it. But in the end, I was convinced that the overall resolution was a worthy resolution, and that it wasn't attacking childless couples, but rather it's making us think about what is the end game.
Yeah, and Joe, you're right. The last whereas, which, by the way, all the resolutions, if anybody wants to read them, they're on SBC.net. So anybody can search them and see these of this year and all previous years as well. They're actually really helpful. But yeah, the last whereas, estimates suggest that between 1 million and 1.5 million human beings are currently stored in cryogenic freezers in an embryonic state throughout the U.S., with most unquestionably destined for eventual destruction. And so, again, it was not ruling it out, right? Because I think there are morally permissible ways to do it, but it usually costs more, which is where the question comes from, because each procedure, right? But to maintain a pro-life, what we say, that life begins at conception. Joe, to that point, I can understand it, although the last two resolves, it says that we grieve alongside couples diagnosed with infertility, and that we commend couples who at great cost have earnestly sought to only utilize infertility treatments and reproductive technologies in ways consistent with these with dignity. So I think there were some phrases to recognize the complexity of this.
Which is probably why I could vote for it.
Correct. Right. It's not an easy one, and I think it's one we've got a lot of learning to do as Christians, and again, as pro-life Christians in particular, because it's not going to get any less complicated. And I think this is a good first step to raise the issue.
So if a couple struggling at FBC, a member, comes to you and says, hey, we're thinking IVF, is this the posture you're going to have, sort of walking them through it?
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely start with that question of what do you mean by IVF, right? Because they may have something different in mind. Let's talk about what limits you're setting ethically, what do you believe is happening? And then, I would discourage, again, the typical use of IVF where you're creating embryos in mass and then destroying. I would say only implant as many as you're going to create, right? So 2 at a time, 3 at a time, knowing you could have triplets, right? I mean, that's part of it, but I think that's exactly it. But that would be my general posture in encouraging couples towards it. Yes, it's going to come at a greater cost, but biblical, to follow Jesus, it does always come with a cost. And sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's just personal. And so, and I think it's a burden we should share in churches with one another and help couples through this as much as we can. So,
all right, so pulling out my SBC thesaurus out again, we have resolutions and then we have amendments. Right. And the law amendment was the big thing. What happened with this law amendment?
Yeah, great question. So it was an amendment related to women serving as pastors in churches. This was another one of those issues that got a lot of headlines and has in recent years. There's several things that go into this, and I think the outcome was confusing to some people. Joe, you and I talked about this there beforehand and after. So for the record, I voted for it, but you voted against it, right?
I did vote against it.
Okay. So my question for you, Joe, actually, we didn't really talk about this. Did you have that decision made up before coming to Indy, or did you change your mind? Or
I had read through it many times and then looked at the implications, and I had my mind pretty made up before we even got to Indianapolis.
Okay, right. I sort of did the opposite. I came in fully convinced to vote for it, which I ended up doing, but I found myself persuaded much more to the side against it because of some of the implications that came with it. So for whatever it's worth, I wasn't as disappointed that it failed once I realized what some of the concerns were. So in short, Southern Baptists, we have very sort of minimal standards for cooperation. A church cannot condone or endorse homosexuality. So if a church does that, that's one of our bylaws, right? So that's not optional.
And a church just got booted for that.
There have been churches that have done that. Yeah. So if they do that, if we find evidence of that, we can say they're no longer in friendly cooperation. And so there's a couple of things like that. In fact, a church that covers up abuse, or that in recent years that was added. I don't know the exact wording, but if it's found that a church is aiding, abetting, that kind of thing, we can also do the same. And so this was an issue to make this that kind of bylaw issue, that if a church employs a woman as a pastor of any kind, which was what the language was written. And so I think that was the phrase that probably got a lot of people nervous or unsure, is what does that mean? Because some churches will toss around the word pastor, youth pastor, and it could be just about anybody that serves in some ways, and they may not be ordained. And, things get complicated when you look at churches that way. So the law amendment wasn't intended to do that. It was presented last year at the convention, but because it was a bylaw change, it required 2 consecutive years to pass.
Understood.
And it needed 2/3. And so the first year it received 80-90%. I mean, it was a pretty high percentage, but people didn't really know it was coming in that sense. Once we've had a year to reflect on it, I think that's where a lot of the discussion and reconsideration came from. So it needed 66%. It received 61%. So failed, but just barely in that way. So one of the sort of headlines or responses is, Southern Baptists now are becoming liberal. This is a drift away from that. They're in favor of women pastors. Okay. Nothing could be further from the truth. And the proof of that, which again, I wrote in the bulletin, we did have a church that endorsed and condoned female pastors, in writing. FBC of Alexandria, one of our legacy churches, one of our oldest churches, most historic churches, and we voted them out at 92%. So at 92%, that's definitive in terms of our commitment to complementarianism. So the issue is not, are we complementarian or not? We absolutely are. The question is, how do we apply it? And that's where the question and the struggle came from. Again, I became more sympathetic to the idea of churches where, again, a pastor may come in and he inherits a staff that has titles like the worship pastor, and it's a woman. And maybe he wants to change that vocabulary, but he's been there 6 months. You're going to disfellowship that church as a result of that and whatever. So I think it was going to create a lot of work. Is the credentials committee going to have to read job descriptions? Like, what do you mean by that? What if people just start using the word minister instead of pastor, right? Does that really get you off the hook? Is it just that one word? I can understand the complexity to it. I think my reason for voting for it was it felt like it set a very clear, clean standard so that we're not having to vote on church after church year after year. We've done this now to 7 churches in the last couple of years, Saddleback being the big one and now Alexandria and a few others. I just don't want that to be the thing we vote on every single year. And it's like that's what we're known for.
I'm not sure that this amendment, though, will mitigate that.
And that may be.
Because if a church appeals, that's when we have to vote on them. So the credentials committee can still disfellowship them, consider them not in friendly cooperation. And if the church accepts that, then they just go about on their way. It's when they appeal that decision that then it is brought back to the convention. And so we may still see that it is going to be an issue that will come up on an annual basis. I think the reason why I voted against it is because of the complexity. It would totally change, I think, the aspect and the responsibility of the credentials committee. And are they now police officers? And as you said, having to go out and read job descriptions of every position within a church.
And just to clarify for those listening, the credentials committee is a voluntary group that looks at the credentials of each SBC church in terms of do they give? Do they follow these other things? Is there a question about it? And so they're kind of a filter for the rest of the convention to do that. And
which is rather new in our convention as well. It's only 2 years, 3 years old, something like that.
Right.
I also looked at some of the arguments of those who were also opposed to it. Jeff Org, the president of the executive committee, was not in favor of it. J.D. Greer, former president of the convention and pastor
and I think
North
Barber,
Carolina,
the current president, was also against it if I picked up his
I think
rhetoric.
So as well.
Yep.
And interestingly, Danny Aiken was against it until 2 weeks before. I was in a breakout session, a lunch with him, and he explained to the luncheon why in the last 2 weeks changed his position. I didn't base my vote in opposition just because of the others who were voting in opposition, but basically because of the extreme bottleneck that I felt it would end up creating in the convention. And for 2 years in a row, we've disfellowshipped churches, and those decisions by the credentials committee were upheld in a vote. So it is working, I think, as it is designed to, without taking a lot of extra time and energy from a volunteer committee.
So as I wrote in the bulletin, we're against women pastors and unnecessary bylaws.
Amen.
That's exactly what it is. So if anybody's like the bottom line, I think without a doubt, where churches have taken what I would call a high-handed egalitarianism, meaning they're doing it knowingly, we have dealt with it correctly every time. And I suspect that will continue. So again, I think that the SBC understands this issue. Applying it is where it gets complicated and difficult. And so, I think we were able to work together, and we'll just see what comes of it down the road. So
I'm honestly surprised this isn't a bigger issue on the floor or for the credentials committee. A church that has women pastors in whatever capacity has to be referred to the credentials committee. Once they get that referral, that's how First Baptist Alexandria came up for this disciplinary action and disfellowshipping. Another church in the area of Northern Virginia reported them to the credentials committee, and the committee looked at it and agreed. I think that might be the only hiccup in there. It seems like there should be a better, because what do we all tell our kids? I don't want to hear a tattletale. Right. And that's basically the environment that we have to have before this comes up, unless the credentials committee finds out about it another way. But I think that part of the process we could do better. That seems to be the one sticking point there for
and
me.
I think the last thing to mention is Baptists also value autonomy, meaning every local church is its own church. We are not technically a denomination. As weird as that sounds, we exist for 2 days a year. It's during the convention. Otherwise, we're just independent churches that do what we do, and we, make decisions 2 days a year, and then it gets done. Obviously, that approach, when it's not a top-down sort of hierarchy, like, say, Presbyterians or Episcopals, other denominations, you're going to have a wide variety of approaches and sort of titles and things like that. So I think that's got to come with some degree of understanding and cooperation and awareness. Respecting that autonomy is a big value undergirding that the reason against this is because it feels like, does everybody's individual issue become a new bylaw down the road? So.
It's also interesting how the media picked up the end results. What was actually reported got a little convoluted as well, but I'm glad to see that we are still firmly complementarian in our beliefs and that the office of pastor is still reserved for men.
We're not telling churches you can't have women pastors. We're just saying you can't be SBC if you are, right? Every church can do what they want. So every church has the right to determine how it's going to function, but the SBC also has the right to determine who works with us.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's a mutual respect that way of understanding that. So again, we're not starting these churches and dissolving them because that's not how we function. But each group has the responsibility to set those parameters. So yeah, we'll see.
One of the bigger things you did not hit on in the bulletin insert that surprised me was the sex abuse scandal, which is obviously, I think, been the main thing that's kind of come out, people are talking about. So what did get talked about with the sex abuse and all that, the task force and all that?
Yeah, so that was a couple of years now when those issues came to light and we began to deal with it. I did not write about this topic in the bulletin, mainly because I didn't feel like I had a grasp on all the issues involved. It was complicated. There was things I understood, some things I didn't understand, and I'm not even sure I still completely understand it. So the task force was appointed a couple of years ago to see what is our response to the sex abuse issues. How bad is it? What can we do? How can we help our churches? The long and short of it, as best I can tell, is that the task force was able to do some things that we asked them to do, but they did not get to bring about robust change like they wanted. And they seemed a little frustrated at the end of the day. I think I'm personally sympathetic to them. I think they wanted to do more for abuse survivors and in showing our support and care. And again, some of those questions quickly turn into like financial issues. Are we going to try to remunerate them, for what they went through? Well, that's where some of these questions get tough with theology, because these are happening in individual local churches. So there's not this but they're wanting the SBC as a whole to do something about it, right? Just because they were an SBC church. So we have lawyers and insurance companies, as I understand it, once we start doing that, then it opens the floodgates for liability for the convention, as if we were, say, the Catholic Church, where decisions are made top down. So there's a real complexity here. But I think I'm sympathetic to the task force who wanted to do more, and some things are still on hold. One of the issues that the convention voted for a couple years ago was to keep a database of known offenders so that churches could see, because that was one of the things that somebody had a list and we didn't have access to that list. And of course they even said we don't have a list, but they actually did have a list, so that created some issues there. But they're obviously running into issues of that. How do you put somebody's information publicly online like that? Do they have to be convicted of something? What if it's, they get accused? So there's a lot of hoops to jump through. And I'm not saying it's quick, simple, easy, just throw names up on a website. I think the will of the messengers is we want to show our support for survivors. We want to prevent this from ever happening, if at all possible, and we want to, move heaven and earth to do this. And so the movements we made, I thought were good, although now time will tell because it goes to the executive committee. So Jeff Org and those guys are going to have to try and implement some of these things. There was some funding issues. I know Send Relief with NAM and IMB, they set aside $4 million, but then they came back and there were some sort of asterisks. It's got to be spent in the convention, not to groups outside the convention.
Yeah, and what they were doing is they created a separate business to facilitate all of this, even though it was the ARITF committee that established this new ARC, ARC I think is what it was, to maintain the database and everything. It's still a separate entity and everything. And Send Relief's funds of that $4 million were to make this all internal. I sort of like the idea of making it external because it's policing ourselves if we don't, and that is where a lot of denominations have gotten into trouble with cover-ups and everything. So I think it's okay. The other thing that I wasn't quite clear on, but I've done some research on it since then, is the issue in insurance. And I just thought, well, what in the world does this insurance have to do with it? Well, if your name ends up on this list and they have already said that they were going to publish information that is not contained on state or national sex offender registries, I don't know what that means. I don't know what kind of data they would be publishing that's not included in some of those databases. But if your name gets put out there on this list and you should not be on there and you decide to sue or press charges, well, there is potential for financial liability on the part of the Southern Baptist Convention, ergo the need for insurance. And so a lot of what they wanted to present to the convention could not be presented because it depended on if we could be insured or not. And I think since the convention, they have found somebody who is willing to insure us for that liability. But that was just one of the hiccups in the whole process of trying to get this thing further than it actually got.
But overall, the ARITF, that task force, I thought did an excellent job with what they had and what they were able to do. I appreciate. And again, they received nothing for this. So many of these committees and groups that do things, like they're literally taking on like a part-time job for a year to serve Southern Baptists. The amount of time they spent probably in meetings, I just can't even imagine. And so they produced this material called Essentials. In fact, our church staff is going to work through it together. How can we prevent abuse and how can we work together to ensure safety for children and families in our church? So that's a really good resource. I just really applaud their efforts. I feel bad that some of it was frustrated, but hopefully they can find a way forward through the executive committee to get more done.
We're doing well on the checklist that the ARITF has made in this Essentials curriculum. There's a whole analysis that churches can go through and check and read and look. Am I doing this? Are we not doing this? How well are we doing? And
you mean we as a church?
We as Forest Baptist Church
right.
are doing quite well in it, which praise the Lord. And we do know that we've had a couple people who were a little sketchy who've tried to come to our church and found it very uncomfortable with all the means that we have in place to prevent abuse, and they've left our church, that's the way it's designed. There's forgiveness and there's grace, but there's also prudence and there is a way to be wise about things.
Well, you don't coddle wolves, you run them off.
Yes.
So I think it's accomplishing its purpose.
If you are a leader in your local church, go out and look for the Essentials curriculum. It is from the Abuse Reform and Implementation Task Force. You can easily find it online. It's free. It has 5 sessions in it, and it will just easily walk you through things like, what are you doing? Are you training your employees? Are you screening your volunteers within your church? Are you taking all the steps that are necessary to protect your children in the church and others? It's not just children, because a lot of this sexual abuse happened adult on adult. How to report it if you have an instance within your church. And then finally, how do you care well for abuse victims and survivors?
Do we feel confident that the abuse is under control at this point or eradicated?
I think eradicate is a strong word, just because you don't know every crook and corner of every place. I think I still think we're behind as a whole in terms of just churches doing more, but I think the level of awareness is higher than it's ever been, and I think that's the first step. So I think for a church or a pastor out there, even a small one with a bivocational pastor or something, to not know anything, it's kind of on them at this point. Enough information is out there. They should know and at least be aware, here's where I get help to start moving. So I think, again, we're moving in the right direction. It's slow, but yeah, in general, I think churches are taking it more seriously than they ever have. And I think we're going to be the better for it down the road.
So finally, there have been, through SBC, some people that have left Forest. And it kind of feels like, to me, sometimes the SBC is, for the church, that relationship where people say, why are you still with that person? There's X, Y, and Z. Why don't you just leave him? Wouldn't it be easier to just walk away? And it feels like we're kind of in that, I see your point, but it's worth sticking around.
Right.
So with all the things, the sex abuse, all the good and bad, is it worth sticking with the SBC?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's worth everyone stopping and thinking about, particularly within our church. So a couple things I think that are important. Number one, cooperation is always hard. I don't care if you're on a T-ball team and you're 5 years old or you're in a garden club in your community. cooperation is always hard. People don't get along. You don't always get what you want. You're going to have to deal with some social misfits, as my friend of mine calls them. You're going to have some difficulties working together. It's always difficult. And so we have to lay next to that, though, another reality. So cooperation is hard, but number two, cooperation is commanded. In the New Testament, we see records in Acts and elsewhere. The little letters of 2nd and 3rd John, they don't get enough attention. The apostle commands churches, receive missionaries, send them just because they stand for the name, right? Those that come commended. That's essentially what we're doing in the SBC, is we're trying to work together to support missionaries, to train pastors, to reconcile those two. It leads us to one conclusion, and that conclusion is this. The answer to hard cooperation is not no cooperation. That's what some would say. Well, it's hard, it's difficult, we don't get what we want, there's some crazies out there, let's just take our ball and go to the other playground, all right? Isolationism seems like a greener pasture, but it is a barren desert where churches go to die. When churches back off from working with others, it zaps you of your kingdom focus, of the very virtues that it takes, right? How else can you show love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control?
Yeah.
It's through working together, right? It's through working with people you maybe don't always see eye to eye with, but for the sake of something greater and larger. And so cooperation, yes, it's commanded, and we have to find a way moving forward. And so the Southern Baptist Convention, for all of its warts and wrinkles, which it has those, it is still the most expansive effort at sending missionaries, of training pastors in the world, and maybe even in all of church history. And I think to be part of that is something special. We don't have to wonder where we are theologically. We don't have to wonder where we are in terms of the gospel. That really is the focus and what holds us together. Again, somebody say, well, what about this group and that group? I promise you, every group has something you won't like.
Yeah.
It may be a lack of resources. It may be a policy, right? I mean, every group is going to have that. It's the nature of cooperation. And so as long as we're going to be saints who are also sinners, it's going to be challenging. And so the SBC still, it provides so much for us as a church, for students and those that want to go into missions and church planting. There's so many opportunities and avenues, but also what we get to be part of. The fact that we could pick up a phone call and go anywhere in the world and work with another missionary and not have to say, well, what do you believe about this or that? Like, it's a tremendous thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we can just pick up the phone, get on a plane, and start working there right off the bat. If a couple wants to go to the mission field, they can be in there in months. We're fully funded. I mean, when else in church history would you have that opportunity? And so I agree. And again, as things get more polarizing in our world, yes, cooperation takes more patience and prayer, and maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's sanctifying, and we just don't like sanctification.
Right.
But I think it's hard, but it's necessary, and I think being part of the SBC is a great joy. Clint Presley did a press conference right afterwards, and he said, somebody asked him, a reporter, news, said, what's the one thing about Southern Baptists that people don't know? And Presley said, despite what you hear, we are actually really joyful people. And I think he's exactly right. To sit in that room of 10,000 people and to sing worship songs, to see the commissioning of missionaries, and literally, I'm sitting there with strangers crying with them as we see families that are going to just tough places in the world. To hear us passionately talk about issues of life and marriage. I mean, where else are you going to get to do that at this level with some of the smartest thinkers and humble leaders? Again, there's always bad eggs, but I think by and large, it is still worth it, and it's so good for the sake of the kingdom. And so I'm hopeful that there's more good than bad, and more bad's behind us, that we can keep moving forward.
I'm in total agreement.
Hey everyone, it's Matt Garcia, your host of FBC Extra. Thank you so much for listening to the episode, and I want to thank Pastor Tyler and Pastor Joe for taking the time to sit down and talk through the SBC with us. Coming up on some future episodes, we are going to have Pastor Tyler come back as he finishes up his sermon series in 2 Samuel. We're going to have him answer some pretty tough questions, not only about the book, but just some general Christian questions that we have, some tough answers. And then from there, we just voted in 12 new deacons at our church. I'm going to try to sit down with as many of them as I can and help them describe what their new roles are as deacons, where they're serving, and what their ministries are going to look like. So stay tuned for that. We look forward to seeing you in the future on FBC Extra.